It's time to test which is best.
The Canon EOS R5
or the Nikon Z8. Let's take a look at the headline specs.
So the Canon EOS R5 has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor, can shoot 20 frames a second, and for video it'll do 8K 30p.
Okay, well the Z8 has a full frame 45.7 megapixel stacked backside illuminated CMOS sensor, can shoot 120 frames per second, and can go up to 8K 60p video. So I think the Z8's just inching ahead a bit.
All right, let's just wait to dig a bit deeper. Oh, hello mate.
Where's my bird autofocus when I need it? That's quite funny.
So the Canon EOS R5 has a 45 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor powered by a Digic X processor. Now the Digic X processor isn't the same in every model. Canon just don't rename it. So it's a bit like Intel calling the processors i7 rather than i7 930, 940 or 950. Hashtag wildlife photographer now.
I know we've already covered sensors, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more in depth because the Z8 has a lot going on. Now it is very similar to the R5 in some ways. It's a similar megapixel count, it's full frame, it's a CMOS sensor, but it is stacked. And that means we've got higher readout speeds, reduces rolling shutter, and it allows us to have a higher continuous frame rate on quite a high megapixel camera. Not only is this a stacked sensor, but it's also backside illuminated, or a BSI sensor. Now that means that the circuitry that literally captures the light and turns it into electronic signals sits on the back of the sensor itself. It makes it far more efficient at capturing light. It means when you're shooting at higher ISOs, you get a lower noise ratio, and it's also faster. It means you get higher continuous frame rates again, and faster autofocus. I do just want to point out there are a few years between these cameras. The R5 was released mid-2020, whereas the Z8 was mid-2023. So that is a big difference in when these cameras were released. Some may deem that a slightly unfair test, but I don't think so, because if you look at where they're placed in their brand's range, look at the price points, it's all very similar. What they're offering is very similar. So I think if you're going to have two cameras in that sort of range, regardless of the fact that maybe that one's a bit older, I think you can still test them against each other. But yeah, I think it's worth acknowledging.
So the Canon R5's continuous frame rate is really good. It'll shoot 20 frames a second with the electronic shutter enabled, or it'll shoot 12 frames a second with the mechanical shutter enabled.
Z8 is very similar, so you can get 20 frames per second in RAW with the electronic shutter, but that is because it's all it has. Like the Z9 before it, it doesn't have a mechanical shutter. So you're just working with electronic, you get 20 frames per second RAW. However, if you drop it down into JPEG, full quality JPEG, you get 30 frames per second, which is quite nice. And if you drop it down again into 11 megapixel JPEGs, then you get 120 frames per second.
Wow,
yes.
impressive.
And it's worth saying as well, yeah, okay, you're not going to want to use 11 megapixel JPEGs all the time, that's why you bought this camera, but for socials and things like that, 11 megapixels is just fine.
More than enough.
I think it is worth pointing out that although these can both shoot 20 frames per second RAW, it's how long you can shoot for as well, because with the R5, I think it's 180 frames.
180.
Yeah, 180 frames before the buffer fills up if you're using like your best card. They're both CF Express Type B as their fastest card slot. With the Z8, they quote it as 1,000 plus. So you can just kind of keep shooting RAWs at 20 frames per second, which is obviously fantastic. And I think it'll make a massive difference if you are shooting, you know, sports wildlife, maybe you're trying to get a wedding, the kiss, whatever it is, like that makes a huge difference. It's a huge difference. And that is what you get from a sort of stacked BSI sensor.
So autofocus is really where the Canon R5 really comes into its own. Yeah. It has dual pixel CMOS AF2 with 5,940 AF points across most of the frame. Now, how many does yours have?
The Z8 does have significantly less, but it is a hybrid AF system with 493 phase detect points across most of the sensor as well. However, in low light, the Z8 steps ahead. It's got starlight mode, which means it can focus down to -9 EV.
And to be fair, the Canon EOS R5 can only go down to 6 EV, -6 EV. So both cameras have subject detection, and I think both of them pretty much covering similar subjects.
Yeah, really similar.
So the R5 has, well, I've got a list here. It has human, face and eye detect, animals, cats, dogs and birds, vehicles, including racing cars and motorbikes.
Okay, so Z8, very similar again. We've got humans, eyes, face, head and torso, animals with bodies, heads and eyes for cats, dogs and birds, and other animals. I assume they've programmed some in, and as people use the camera more, we'll find out what that is. Also cars, motorbikes, bicycles and trains, which are grouped together in one category. Aeroplanes have a separate category because apparently this can focus on the whole craft, or it can focus on like the front of the plane or the cockpit. So it should be great for air shows. I'm looking forward to testing this next year actually on a bunch of air shows. But we think in general for most shooters they're probably going to use that human AI. Human IAF more than anything else. So it's also the easiest one for us to test. We're going to set up a little test now so you can see how these perform against each other. And now for the main event.
Image quality. I'm pretty biased towards the R5. I've used it extensively over the last 18 months, especially in studio. So I do love this camera and what it can do. Obviously the Z8 has not been out that long. So I think it's important to provide some side-by-side comparisons to see what they can do when pitched against each other.
And here are some of the more real-world images we've shot whilst testing these cameras.
Both the R5 and Z8 feature IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, with Nikon calling theirs or as Nikon call it, vibration reduction. Now the Canon R5 has 8 stops of 5-axis IBIS, depending on what lens you use.
The Z8 is a bit weird, unless I'm being incredibly silly, which is possible, and I'm sure you'll tell me in the comments. Nikon don't seem to list what the separated stops of their IBIS is. They have it, it says 5-axis IBIS, and after doing some reading, a few articles have said 6 stops, so maybe that's correct. But we're going to test it anyway, right? So we're going to have both cameras, we're going to hand hold them, we're going to have it off and then on, we're going to half press the shutter, and you should be able to see the difference, hopefully, if they're any good. I've done this test so many times. So that was on sport, 1 second, barely usable. Let's just try normal just to make sure. I just did my favourite completely non-scientific test, which is to just handhold the cameras to see what type of long exposure I can get. We've got similar lenses on these cameras. We've got the 24-70 2.8 made for Z on the Z8. We've got the RF 24-70 2.8 for the R5. So we're pretty evenly matched here. R5, I knew it'd be good. I've used it before quite a bit. 4-5 seconds, easy, just got to hold your breath. 6 seconds, pushing it a little bit. 8 seconds, it's actually still usable depending on what you're shooting. This is not so good. I've tried it in normal and sport, and I'm struggling. I can't get 3, can't get 2.5. I mean 2 at a push, but it's like luck. Not super impressed with that, I've got to say. Maybe that's why the CEPA rated stops on Nikon's website, because maybe it's just not as good.
So one way to deal with a low light environment is to make use of the image stabilization within a camera by running lower shutter speeds. However, it's also important to test the ISO capabilities of these cameras. So with the Canon R5, we have a range of ISO 100 to 51,200, and with the Z8, we have a range of 64 ISO to 25,600.
Now what we're going to do is put both of these cameras on a tripod, take a picture just running through those ISO ranges so you can compare the two, and we'll put a little zoom in bit, so look out for that, because then you'll be able to see exactly how granulated the picture is getting.
So the Canon R5 weighs in at 738 grams. And for that, you get a top LCD and a pretty decent range of knobs and buttons. It's quite a modern design with this mode dial and customizable view on the top screen. It has a fully articulating rear screen, dual card slots, one CF Express and one SD UHS 2. On the left, you have a micro HDMI port, a USB-C port which can be used for connectivity and charging, a headphone port, microphone port and flash sync ports. The camera uses the LPE6 NH battery, which is CIPA rated to 490 shots via the viewfinder or 320 shots by the rear LCD.
The Nikon Z8 weighs in at 910 grams, so it's not particularly light. We do have a top LCD screen and we've got quite a lot of controls on the top left-hand side of the camera, like we often see from Nikon. It has quite a deep grip with a design that feels very familiar, so if you're using a DSLR and you want to move to a Z series, this might be the one for you. The rear screen is only a tilting screen, and I think that poses a bit of an issue. I like that you can shoot from the hip, you can shoot from above, and you can do it portrait as well, so you can go up that way. But I don't think it's just YouTubers who need a fully articulating screen. There's also people like estate agents, architects who might need to be right at the edge of a room and put the camera right in a corner and be able to flip that screen round. You're going to have people who do product photography who maybe have the camera mounted in a weird position, need to be able to switch that screen round. And of course, yes, people who like to film themselves, maybe take self-portraits, things like that. So I do think for some people that's going to be a bit of an annoyance, but in terms of like everyday lifestyle shooting, like some of the stuff we were doing here today, the tilting screen is absolutely fine. You get dual card slots, again, one CF Express Type B and a UHS 2 SD card slot, just like the R5. On the other side, you get a microphone and headphone port, flash sync, a full-sized HDMI, much better, and two USB-C ports, which allow you to properly charge and transfer data at the same time. It takes the EN-EL15C battery, it can also take the A and B, and it's rated to 370 shots with the monitor or 340 shots with the viewfinder, but of course you get more than that.
In terms of video, both cameras give us very solid offerings. Both bodies offer 8K recording in RAW format, but the Z8 can record in 8K at 60 frames per second, while on the R5 it's limited to 30 frames per second. The R5 offers RAW only in the 8K resolution, and the Z8 can record in RAW in other resolutions as well. Bear in mind the 8K files are massive, so make sure your CF Express cards are fast enough to handle 8K recording. If you want to use 8K on a regular basis, go with the Nikon, as the Canon R5 is a bit more prone to overheating. But remember, there is the R5C if you want to negate that. With default settings, I like the footage coming from the Nikon more. It had less noise in the shadows and a more pleasing colour rendition. Important thing to note is to turn on the 4K HQ mode on the Canon, as without it the 4K video is rather soft. When it comes to video autofocus, on standard settings the Z8 felt less snappy at times, but when I set both cameras to maximum speed and sensitivity, they both work great, although the R5's focus shifts were smoother and more natural. Both cameras' AF is perfectly usable, but it's a matter of balancing the settings so it's both snappy but not jarring.
So one of the main differences that we both noticed today was the viewfinder. I would say that I've mostly been shooting with the R5 and you mostly with the Z8. And obviously we've swapped throughout the day. And I actually found the experience quite jarring. The shooting experience with the R5 is phenomenal. The image out of the viewfinder is punchy, it's contrasty, and it looks extremely organic, making me enjoy the shooting experience quite a lot. Going to the Z8, the image looks almost synthetic and over-sharpened. Wouldn't you agree?
I find it a bit frustrating. We've got 5.7 million dot in the R5, 3.7 in the Z8, and the fact that this is 3 years newer, same price point, it's unacceptable. With the R5, when you're looking through the viewfinder, you can be excited about your image, and I just didn't get that as much from the viewfinder on this, which I know is, for most people, a really small point, but if it affects how much you like shooting, then it is a big point, because you might not take the camera out as much, or you might not use it as much, or you might not put it up to your eye as much, and that does make a difference. It's been a really interesting day comparing these two. Obviously, we haven't been able to use the Z8 as much as the R5 over the last little while. It just hasn't been out as long, so it's been nice to get to grips with it a little bit. I hope we've given you guys enough information for you to decide which is your favourite. I think we both know what our favourite is, but we've given you loads of tests to have a look at. So let us know in the comments what your thoughts are, Z8 versus R5, what you think. I would say that they both have pros and cons. I think one has a bit more than the other, but
I think it's unfortunate that the R5 came out 3 years ago, because I feel like this camera is kind of like in my bones. You know, I've used it so much in studio, shooting for MPB. I really felt its strengths in a real kind of shooting environment, whereas I felt the Z8 just didn't have that level of sheen that I felt the R5 has. But I think it's one of those cameras that I think I definitely want to shoot a lot more with. I've always been a big fan of the Nikon Z range, from the Z7 and the Z9, which I think are phenomenal cameras. So I think it's something that I need to explore further. And like you said, Amy, you know, it does have incredible strengths, certainly in video and in shooting speed, for example, which is, you know, you can't deny.
Regardless of usability or which one we're more used to, the tests don't lie. Jakob said off camera earlier that the video specs of the Z8 basically smash the R5, because obviously you can record a lot longer. The specs are fantastic on this. If you are a hybrid shooter, this has a lot going for it. Remember as well, there is the R5, but there's also the R5C. You don't really lose any stills capability when you go for an R5C, so it's worth keeping in mind. But let us know in the comments what you've thought of these two cameras. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything that's coming up. But for now, a massive thank you for watching from me and Ian, and I hope you join us again in the next video from MPB.
Let's just dig a bit deeper. Let's dig a bit deep, dig a bit deeper. Okay, I can do that.